Hi guys, we want to talk about the book of Numbers today. So we're continuing our journey through the Pentateuch. We've seen Genesis, we've seen what God has done in establishing humanity and then the Abrahamic covenant and his covenant with Abraham's descendants. We've seen Exodus, how the people become a great nation. We've seen Leviticus, how the holy presence of God living among the people is driving God's people to perform rituals and to behave in such a way that is in accordance with God's holiness, which we've talked about how that's different from righteousness or moral purity, but it's about separation. So now we're going to come to the book of Numbers. And as we come to the book of Numbers, let's understand that we're really picking back up the story that in a lot of ways we press pause on in Exodus, especially Exodus 32 and 33 at Mount Sinai. We're going to start at Mount Sinai and we're going to ask the question, how did the people of Israel end up wandering around in the desert for 40 years? What happens on those wanderings? And then how does that inform us as we prepare to move out of the Pentateuch? Now, of course, we'll have Deuteronomy before we get to the books of Joshua and Judges, but Joshua and Judges are really going to pick up the story told in Numbers. So just think about that as you're piecing together the narrative flow of the Bible. Let's get started. So we want to look at Numbers, which are stories from the wilderness. The first thing we want to look at here are our lecture goals. So remember, in our lecture goals, we always want to understand critical issues involved in interpreting any book of the Bible. And once we get out of the Pentateuch, we'll be talking about stuff like authorship every time. But as we've talked about, a lot of that was covered in the intro to the Pentateuch lecture. We want to understand the background of the book of Numbers. We want to understand the general outline of the book of Numbers, which is really how this whole lecture is structured. And then we want to understand how the narrative of Numbers contributes to the narrative of the Pentateuch and of the Old Testament as a whole. So that's what we're going to be working through as we go through this lecture. One of the first things I want us to talk about as we jump into Numbers is I want us to talk about the title. We've seen this in a couple of other places already, like in the book of Genesis. I like focusing on titles because titles help inform us about what we expect to read. So we talked about how in Genesis, the word Genesis in English, while it's not a word that we use a lot, tells us that we're talking about these beginnings, or maybe more appropriately, origins. And we're going to see some similar things depending on how we understand the title of Numbers. So let's kind of move to that. When we're looking at the title of Numbers, the English comes from the Septuagint, two numberings. The Hebrew title, however, comes from in the wilderness. Now let's start with the Septuagint, right? The reason the Septuagint talks about two numberings is because there's two censuses that are going to be taken in the book of Numbers, the numbering of the people. So you see how that's kind of drawing out this like focal moment in the book in and of itself. The Hebrew title is in the wilderness, and that's coming from the first words of the book. The original Hebrew title is Vayadever, meaning and Yahweh spoke to Moses, literally, and he spoke to Moses. Each name shows a different emphasis on the major message of the book. So let's pause there and just think briefly about this, that what we have in our kind of options as we're going through trying to understand the book of Genesis, that we have a title from the Septuagint, the two numberings that would say the two censuses that are taken are the focal moment. We have the Hebrew title in the wilderness that would say the focal moment is just the narrative of what happens in the wilderness. And then, if we're going to go with the Vayadever, this older Hebrew title for the book, then what we actually have there is this understanding that what's important is that God speaks in Numbers, that this is continued revelation. All of this, of course, is within the bigger framework of the story that God is telling in the Pentateuch. Let's look at some of the background issues related to the book of Numbers. So we want to look at Numbers composition. Let's take this separately for a moment from the broader discussion of authorship and composition of the Pentateuch. A lot of scholars, especially in the book of Numbers, say, well, Numbers must have like a really messy history of how different sources came to be put together. Remember, we would talk about that as redaction. We talked about that back in our material on the Pentateuch. So here's what's going on in the Pentateuch, right? In the book of Numbers, is that Numbers seems kind of messy. Think about all the things that are going to happen. We're going to see a census. We're going to see stories about Balaam. We're going to have the stories about the serpents in the wilderness. We're going to see the stories about the failure to enter into the land. it just seems in some ways like there's a bunch of random stories that come out. And so for that reason, a lot of scholars have just said, something, there doesn't really seem to be a cohesion to the book of Numbers. It's just a bunch of randomly collected stories, and they kind of look at it as the catch-all book of the Pentateuch. We're going to really challenge that. We're going to see that there is, in fact, a framework to Numbers. We're going to use a framework that was originally proposed by Dr. Dennis Cole, who that's someone who's very close to me. He was my doctoral supervisor at NOBTS, and I'm privileged to continue to serve alongside him in our teaching roles here at NOBTS. So we'll look at that. We also want to again just remind everyone that Numbers is serving this narrative bridge between the events of Exodus and the events that are going to happen in Joshua and Judges. Now, of course, Leviticus separates Exodus from Numbers, but remember, we pressed pause on the narrative. Leviticus was about, this is how the priests are to behave. This is how the festivals are to take place. And so outside of really just a couple of narratives in the book of Leviticus, especially the narrative about the sons of Aaron, we don't have a lot of advance in the story. And then Deuteronomy will be the same way. Deuteronomy separates Numbers from Joshua, but Deuteronomy is going to be in a lot of ways a recapitulation, or at least a retelling, a re-emphasizing of what's happened in the Pentateuch up to this point. So from a narrative perspective, once again, just keep that in mind, that you have that bridge that Numbers is serving between Exodus, the narrative of Exodus, and the narrative of Joshua and Judges. All right, let's now take a look at some issues related to the structure of Numbers. So as I said, Numbers has a structure that is really often debated. I want us to understand when we talk about structure, we might say that we're talking about the bones of literature. We're thinking about how does an author construct his or her work. A familiar structure to us is the structure of a fairy tale, where you have an introduction, once upon a time. Notice that the moment that I say once upon a time, we know that it's a fairy story, right? Then we're going to have the plot, and then we are going to have the resolution. And the resolution, especially in the way we do modern fairy stories, is often going to be they lived happily ever after. Now, I'm talking about a fairy tale there. There's other ways of looking at fairy stories. My point is just this: we recognize that structure, right? Numbers has a unique structure, but I want us to understand some of the things related to the structure of the book of Numbers. So let's take a look at that. So the book of Numbers is difficult to understand because, as we said, there seems to be a lot going on here. And we want to look at the three main sections proposed by Dr. Dennis Cole. So let's look at Dr. Cole's three main sections. So he proposes that there are the stories of Sinai. He's going to say there's cycles of stories within these three main sections. And that the stories of Sinai, you have cycle A when the community is in faithful purity, and then cycle B, which is primarily about the tabernacle and the community of faith. Then there's three cycles of disobedience or rebellion, and we're going to see those three cycles play out in the center of the book of Numbers. And then finally, we're going to see an Advent cycle, which is going to be obedience. And so what he means here, and we're going to move on from this because we're about to go into all this in detail. What Dr. Cole means by Advent is he means remember, Advent means coming, and he means the arrival of the new generation that is now on the scene in the book of Numbers. So I want to look at that, and what we're going to do to go through Numbers is just go through that structure and kind of outline Numbers in detail, and pause along the way to talk about some really specific moments in the book of Numbers, especially some that are important for the overall themes in biblical theology. So let's go through and take a look at this. We see the first cycle here is the cycle of faithfulness at Sinai. And I want us that begins in chapter 1, where there's a census of warriors taken. And then in chapter 2, we're going to see the order of the encampment. Let's talk for a moment. Why would you take a census of warriors? And then they notice they take a census of men, and they take a census of men of a certain age. And that's because Israel is counting her army. So God is commanding, hey, count the number of people you have so you can begin to organize yourself as a military unit who is going to go out and who is going to take the land that I have given you. That's what Numbers is about. So at the beginning of Numbers, we would expect this to be a story about how the people go out into the land and then conquer the promised land, because God is having the people count the army. Then in Numbers chapter 2, we have the order of the encampment. and let's just make an observation about the order of the encampment that connects us with some things that we saw in Leviticus. So when we look at the order of the encampment, notice that what's happening here is that we have the tabernacle in the middle of the encampment. And so then around the tabernacle, and you can see this on this image, but then you can also see it kind of in this, this sketch here. Around the tabernacle, you have the Merarites, the Gershonites, the Kohathites, and then Moses and Aaron and the other priestly families. These are the different groupings of the Levites that immediately surround the temple. Okay, so then outside the temple, you have the remainder of the tribes of Israel that are camped outside the tabernacle. So again, just to be clear, what I want us to see here, notice how the role of the Levites, the tribe of Levi, is to be the barrier between the people and God's holiness. And so I just want us to see that. That's not surprising based on what we saw in the book of Leviticus, that the whole purpose of the Levitical priesthood and then the various duties performed by the different groups of Levites was to be this reminder to the people that a holy God lived in their presence. So I just want us to see that we see very clearly in Numbers with the way the camp is described that God is the center of Israel's life. And then we have the Levites who are representing the people to God and are in many ways, the barrier between a holy God and an unholy people. And that's the reason they perform all of their duties, is a reminder that God is there's a holy God graciously living among an unholy people. And again, you can connect that with a lot of the things that we saw in the book of Leviticus. All right, well, let's continue to move forward. So let's look at how this faithfulness structure continues. So we see in Numbers 3 through 4, no surprise after we've had the order of encampment that we go to the Levitical duties and then a census of the Levites. And then we have the laws of the camp given in Numbers 5. And in Numbers 6, we talk about Nazirite vows. We'll return in just a moment and go do kind of a deeper dive on Nazirite vows. In cycle B, we have a focus on the tabernacle. So we have the offering that the leaders are to make, the consecration of the Levites, the celebration of the Passover. I would just tell you guys, keep in mind as we go through both of these interpreting the Old Testament classes, anytime you see Passover celebrated, it's a moment that's kind of demarcating a moment of significance in Israel's life. And then we have the making of the silver trumpets. And then the silver trumpets are to be blasted as the people begin to head out for battle. So as we're looking at, what's going on there, why does it end with the making of the silver trumpets? Because you're going to blow the trumpets and you're going to head out for battle. So these are the cycles of obedience that we've seen, and it should be no surprise to us that in this cycle of obedience that the people are doing what God has called them to do, and it looks like they're about to march, this army that's just been counted, these priests that have been, once again, we've been told about their consecration. They've made the appropriate sacrifices. They've crafted the trumpets that are going to be ceremoniously blown as God's people go off to war, to do battle, to receive the land that God has given them. All that seems to be imminent as we come out of the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers in these cycles of obedience. All right, let's continue to move forward here. I want us to look for a little bit here at some things about the rebellious generation in the wilderness. So in the rebellious generation in the wilderness, we have these three cycles that come up. Cycle number 1 is going to be a cycle that focuses on the journey from Sinai to the wilderness of Zin, which is sometimes talked of as the wilderness of sin, depending on how it's translated in your Bible. So here's the things that are going to happen here. Notice that in 11, as they go out, instead of being a victorious army marching to inherit the land that God has given them, they start to complain. And they're going to have a variety of complaints. They're going to complain about the food. Chapter 12, we're going to have the authority of Moses challenged. And then in 13 through 14, we are going to have the rejection of the promised land, where spies are going to go into the promised land and they are going to say, hey, this is not for us. This is something that we cannot do, which is, of course, a direct rejection of what God has desired for the people. I want to note a couple of things about the way that the people go out into the promised land. Is that when the people go out into the promised land, they go out into the promised land with 12 spies, representatives from every tribe. from which only 2 come back with a positive report, Joshua and Caleb. I find it striking, and we'll note this when we get to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua sends 2 spies out into the promised land, which I just find interesting, that Joshua is basically saying, look, we're not doing this by democratic vote. We know we're going in. We're just sending 2 people out in order to spy out the land for us. And I think it's, again, significant that only 2 had come back with a positive report the previous time. The next thing we're going to have is the rebellion of Korah, and that's going to be in 16 through 19. So Korah is going to rise up and challenge Moses' leadership as they have failed to go into the land. That's going to end poorly for Korah, with the ground swallowing up him and his rebels. Rebellion cycle number 3 is actually going to deal with the rebellion of Moses himself. It's going to talk about Moses' disobedience at Meribah. And that's going to happen in chapter 20 through, in chapter 20. And what's going to happen in the waters of Meribah is that Moses is going to be told to speak to the rock at Meribah in order for water to come out of it. And Moses instead strikes it with his staff. This is given as the reason that Moses doesn't enter into the promised land with the people, that he's going to die before they enter into the promised land, something that takes place in the book of Deuteronomy. And that seems really harsh until we understand what's at stake here. If God tells Moses to speak to the rock, and Moses speaks to the rock, then it's very clear that Moses is serving as God's prophet. What's happened is Moses has already struck a rock with his stick before, and that there's been water that has come out of the rock. This is something that God's already allowed Moses to do. So why would God care about the method in which Moses does this? This would be the argument that I have for this. God tells Moses to speak to the rock, and the offense that Moses commits here is that Moses, by doing what's familiar and doing something that's very visibly him doing, striking the rock, it seems now like Moses and his magic stick are leading people through the promised land. In other words, the one that can give us water is Moses. Where if Moses is following God and things are changing, time by time, based on what God wills to use to bring about water and sustenance for his people, and Moses speaks in obedience as God has told him to the rock to give water, then what would happen there is it's very clear that God is the one who gives the people what they need. And so this is the point where we see Moses himself enter into rebellion. Another thing that we have happen here that we'll zoom in on in a little bit is that God is going to use Balaam to prophesy, and that's in this section as well, chapters 20 through 24. Then lastly, we have the 4th cycle of rebellion, which is the idolatry at Peor, where the people are going to begin worshiping the Baals. So we have all of this happening in these rebellion cycles. So we have this happening. Let's zoom in on a couple of sections here, and these are I want to go back to some things that happen in the cycles of obedience in Numbers 5, and then we'll look in a moment at Numbers 6. So this is Numbers 5, 11 through 31. We read a strange ordeal that a woman is going to be subjected to if she's accused of adultery and there's no witness. So if a woman is accused of adultery but there is no witness, her husband is to present her to a priest along with a flour offering. The priest is to take dust from the floor of the tabernacle and place it in the water. The priest dishevels the woman's hair, so he messes her hair up and has her drink the water. If it turns her stomach bitter, she's guilty. If the water has no effect on her, then she is perceived to be innocent. Now, this is one of those super weird sections of the Old Testament. And actually, when I get to go speak to students or to college groups or whoever asks me to come speak about the Old Testament, this is actually a text I always bring up because it seems super antiquated. It seems super superstitious. And then it also seems anti-woman, right? I mean, what's going on? This poor woman has to go and sit in the temple and have her hair messed up by a priest, and then have to drink this water to determine whether she's guilty or she isn't guilty. I think this is one of those cases where we read this in conjunction with other texts from the ancient Near East and see how this is distinct from other things that are happening in similar cultures. We actually see God pouring out grace on his people. Let's look at another text. This is from the Code of Hammurabi, which you may have heard of the Code of Hammurabi. So the temple ordeal can be compared to the river ordeal in the Code of Hammurabi. So this is a quote from that code. If the finger was pointed at the wife of a seigneur, that's a weird way of just saying a landowner, someone who's considered a full citizen. So if the finger was pointed at the wife of a citizen because of another man, but she was not caught while lying with another man, she shall throw herself into the river for the sake of her husband. So here's the idea, okay? If she's accused and there's no witnesses, so in other words, she wasn't caught red-handed doing this, but she was accused of it, she then throws herself into the river. And the idea is that if she survives, if she's not drowned, then she was innocent because the gods rescued her in her innocence. But if she does drown, then she must have been guilty. And why does she do this? For the sake of her husband. Boy, you want to talk about anti-woman? There it is. So a woman who might be completely innocent is supposed to throw herself into a river and then see whether or not she lives coming out the other side. And as we consider that this is a culture that's on, these major riverways where, especially during the rainy season, they're going to be, flooded rivers, we see that that's certainly not a certain proposition that the woman comes out of that ordeal alive. Compare that to the temple ordeal. The temple ordeal is basically saying if the woman is in fact guilty, then God is going to supernaturally act in order to turn her womb bitter. And in that case, the people are going to know and the priests are going to know that she was guilty of adultery. In other words, the Bible tells us an ordeal that says God himself is able to act to indict the guilty, where other cultures have similar ideas, but in their similar ideas, they say we have to see if the gods will act to save someone who might be innocent. The bigger picture there is this, as we see the foundational justice of God's law. We also see this, that adultery is a serious thing and it's taken serious in the biblical text, and we shouldn't shy away from that. So we see that in the temple ordeal. The reason I like to talk about this, especially with college students, is a lot of times we do hear that the Bible is anti-woman and antiquated. And what I think we see in this passage is that when you compare the Bible to its ancient Near Eastern text, we see one, it is in many ways, shares the worldview of its broader culture. But the other thing that we see is that we have no doubt as to which one is a more just system. We see God's justice in Numbers 5. We see the cruelty of a pagan culture in the Code of Hammurabi. All right, let's look also at the Nazirite vow. So we're going to look at this. This is in Numbers 6. And you might be aware of this because there's some relatively famous Nazirites in the Old Testament. So the Nazirite vow basically says that Nazirites have to take 3 vows. They're not to touch the fruit of the vine, they're not to have a razor come upon their head, and they're not to touch a dead body. And the view could be for life or for a specific time. And the distinction here, as we've talked about in many things with holiness, is that it's supposed to set somebody apart. It's supposed to delineate them from their normal counterparts. In other words, Nazirites are supposed to be a reminder that a holy and different God lives among us. And it's basically a way of saying, even if you're not born into a priestly family, but you feel that God's called you to a life of specific service and holiness, the Nazirite vow is available. And there's some famous Nazirites. Probably the most famous is Samson, because we're told explicitly that Samson is a Nazirite. That we also know Samuel is a Nazirite. And there's a lot of speculation that perhaps John the Baptist took Nazirite vows, though that's not something we know for sure. With Samson, I would just call your attention, and we'll talk about this when we get to Judges, those 3 things that Nazirites aren't supposed to do. They're not supposed to partake of the fruit of the vine, a razor's not supposed to touch their head, and they're not supposed to touch a dead body. We actually see two of those things Samson directly breaks, and one of those things Samson probably breaks, because Samson's partying with the Philistines, so he probably partook of the fruit of the vine. The Bible seems to imply that. But it tells us that he touches the dead body of a lion. That's breaking his vow. So what's happening whenever we finally are told about Delilah shaving his head? Samson doesn't have magic hair. And why does Samson tell Delilah this? Well, because Samson seems to think that everything is about him and that his Nazirite vow has no real connection to the success and blessing that God is pouring out on him. Letting someone shave his head isn't the beginning of breaking his vow. It's showing us that he absolutely had no desire to keep his vow before God. And so that's something that's going to affect how we read that story. All right, let's look at a few things specific to the rebellion cycles before we move forward. We are going to move a bit quicker now. So in the journey to Canaan, this is where we see the people miraculously fed by manna and quail. And the people are going to come to the edge of Sinai at Kadesh Barnea. This is one of those place names that you should be aware of. So Kadesh Barnea is going to be up here. So notice that that's not how the people are eventually going to enter into the promised land. They're going to go up to the plains of Shittim and Moab and enter in near Jericho, just north of the Dead Sea. But Kadesh Barnea is here. That's the first place where the Israelites have the opportunity to come into the promised land. So as they journey into Canaan, we're also, as we talked about in Numbers 13, they send out 12 spies. 10 return with a negative report. I think this is an important passage for us, and we see this in the archaeological record. It says, the spies report, we came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified, very large. And besides, we saw descendants of Anak there. The descendants of Anak, there can be some debate about what they mean by that. They probably mean there were very large people in the land. But here's what they mean by the towns being fortified. This is the walls of the Canaanite city at what that time was called Jebus, and we would call Jerusalem. This is in the city of David. This is actually underneath some modern areas of the city of Jerusalem. You see how big these walls are? That's what they mean. They say, hey, I just don't see any way we're going to be able to take that city. Another thing that we should note is that some of these cities were so well fortified that they had things like, gate technology that they hadn't seen before. These are the arch gates of Ashkelon, a Philistine city. And this is just very innovative technology. Now, obviously, these wooden structures have been put in by the Israeli Antiquities Authority to preserve this. But you guys can see how this mud brick was developed into an arch gate. And then this is also the walls near Ashkelon, just to show you how advanced their technology was to fortify their city. You might say, why would you build your walls in an angled way like that? Because it ensures that no one is going to be able to tunnel underneath your walls, because they will collapse on top of you if you try to do it, because of the weight of the structure over and above the walls. All right, so let's again move quickly through this. So as we have the rebellion that is going to take place here, the people are going to rebel, and they're going to launch a full rebellion and seek new leaders to lead them where? Back to Egypt. That's how seriously they take these, they see this as hopeless. Note that it doesn't seem to cross their minds that the God who parted the Red Sea can now give them victory over this people. So that's the faithlessness on display. God speaks to the assembly and says he'll destroy them. Moses intercedes for the people, and God graciously forgives the people. And the result is that the generation of the rebels, except for Caleb and Joshua, will not see the promised land, but will die in the wilderness. Okay? The people are then going to try to invade the land without God's blessings. They fail, which I think is something that will make even more sense to us when we get to the book of Joshua. Then God outlines the offerings to be made in the promised land. And this is giving hope that, hey, you're not going into the promised land now, but the day is going to come where you are going to go into the promised land after this period of rebellion. You can see the things that are happening in rebellion cycles B and C. We already talked about several of these things, especially the waters of Meribah, which is what's happening in Moses' disobedience. Let's look in particular at something that happens in chapter 21 of the book of Numbers, and that is the account of the serpents. So in the book of Numbers, we need to see that in chapter 21, we have this narrative. And in the narrative, essentially what happens is that God afflicts the grumbling people with what were called fiery serpents. And these are almost certainly poisonous serpents. And so the people begin to be bit, and now they cry out to God in help, because they are now saying, hey, we understand that we have sinned against God, and we're crying to God to save us. And so they are delivered whenever they repent. And then whenever they repent, they're delivered through their faith. And here's the faith, right? God says, make a serpent that is going to be set on a pole, and you're going to look at that serpent and know that God is a God who is a God of healing, and he will heal you. So you come to repentance, then you demonstrate faith looking at the serpent on the pole, and God heals you. This has profound application to the New Testament, because what does Jesus tell us in the New Testament? Jesus tells Nicodemus in John chapter 3 that as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And that's what he means in John 3:16, when he says, for God so loved the world, or a way that we could translate it, God loved the world in this way. What way? The kind of way that the Son of Man would be lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. That's how much God loved the world. And so that's an essential passage for understanding the background of John chapter 3. Let's look also at the Balaam narratives. We're not going to take too long here, but I want us to see the Balaam narratives. The Balaam narratives tell us something powerful about prophecy. So I want you to be familiar with the material that is here on the slide. But the biggest thing that I want us to see here is that the king Balak is going to try to pay Balaam in order to curse Israel. But what's going to happen is that Yahweh is going to show through a series of miraculous events that you can't actually do that. That if Balaam is going to be a true prophet, God's actually going to miraculously intervene, where Balak actually ends up paying Balaam to bless Israel. Here's what we see through this passage, and it has to inform our theology of prophecy, is that God is in control of the prophets, not kings. If the kings are paying someone to say what they want, those are soothsayers, and those are people who are going to come under condemnation. But true prophets are under God's control and not under the king's control. All right, as we move to finish up here, I want us to look briefly at the Advent cycles. We have a new census of warriors taken. The daughters of Zelophehad tell us that women can hold property rights in order to keep that property in the family. We have various offerings and festivals, and then the conquest of the Transjordan territory. And we see that what's going to happen here is that the people are going to go, you can see this green line moving here, the people are going to go into the Transjordan, coming up to Mount Nebo, which is where Moses is going to die, and then they'll later go on to the plains of Moab. So this is the Advent cycle that occurs here, and then we're going to have the ending of this is going to be a recap of the journey from the instructions at the beginning to the taking of the promised land, and then the boundaries of the land and the Levitical refuge cities, and then finally in chapter 36, the marriage of Zelophehad's daughter, showing that God is faithful to continue to bring about an inheritance. I want you guys to just think through some of the major theological themes that all of this reveals to us in the book of Numbers. And here's the big one that I really want to focus in on. The big one that I want to focus in on is God's sovereign movement in Israel's story. That God is not called a people who are morally pure. What we actually see in the book of Numbers is that even these people who have seen God work in miraculous ways still show themselves to be a faithless and hard-hearted people. Yet God still is gracious to them and is still fulfilling all of the promises that He has made to Abraham and the promises that He has made to the people to bring them into a land, though He's going to do it in the subsequent generation. Also want us to note the role of Moses here, is that Moses is serving as God's prophet throughout the book of Numbers. And we're going to need to see that as we move into the book of Deuteronomy and really look at some of the ways in which Deuteronomy helps outline for us what a prophet is supposed to be. And we're also going to need to think foundationally of how all of that points us to Christ. I hope this has been a helpful lecture for you. If you have any questions, please make sure that you are reaching out to your professor for the course. Remember, this is not just trivia. Jesus talks about the book of Numbers in John chapter 3, one of the most famous books of the Bible, showing us the interconnectivity of the Bible and how all of the Bible is pointing towards God's message of grace as the triune God redeems His people. So make sure that you guys are seeking understanding on this, ask good questions, and we hope that we can help you in whatever way we can. Thanks.